Hey everyone, welcome to the Council of Trent podcast. I'm your host, Catholic Answers apologist and speaker, Trent Horn. Joining me today is Dr. Josh Rasmussen. He is professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University, and we are here at the Capturing Christianity Conference. I know this looks like a basketball court because it is a basketball court. It's where everyone's taking their lunch breaks for the conference. I gave some breakouts earlier, had a debate last night. That was a ton of fun.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Oh,
Everybody loved it.
Well, here's the thing. Like, the thing that makes me most nervous doing a debate like that is not people in the audience. It's not debating Ben. It's a philosopher like you sitting in the front row.
Oh, yeah. I was analyzing
he
line by
knows all
line.
the fallacies. He knows all of them.
I was judging you. No, just kidding. It was wonderful. You did fantastic.
Fallacies of accident. Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
No, it's true. Yeah. I would tell you if you didn't.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And it was a lot of fun. And it's been really enjoyable to sit with you and have philosophical chats about a lot of different things. And so what I want to do today, this conference the theme is, by the way, God exists. Cameron Bertuzzi, very nice slogan. I love it. And so we've had a lot of different arguments that were presented. I thought it'd be fun for you to talk about an argument that was not presented at this conference, but it's something you've been working on. Well, you kind of presented a little bit on your breakout, and that is the relationship between consciousness and God, like the argument from consciousness, or what is consciousness, how it relates to who we are, what God is. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so one thing I've been thinking a lot about and researching is the nature of consciousness and also the origin of consciousness. In my breakout, I focused in on the nature of consciousness, and I made the argument that thinking, feeling, desiring, those things, I don't think those are analyzable purely in terms of third-person geometric material states. So I think there's more to you than just matter.
Okay, so like to say that I am having an experience of interviewing you. Like I see you, you're holding the microphone, we're here in the gym. That experience, because we could think, for example, if there was just space, time, matter, and energy, we could reconstruct it in a comprehensive description, where all the particles are. Like if I was detailed enough, I could re-describe this gym around us.
We could duplicate you atom for atom. We could duplicate all of this situation.
Yeah, we could re-describe it and not lose any of the essence, except for even if you describe all like my neurons, everything that's physical, it's not consciousness though.
I'm not going to figure out what it's like to be you thinking about me just by looking at your brain. So I would have to still ask you, right? Like, what's it like to be you thinking about me? Do you like me? Now, maybe there's some correlations between the brain states that people have identified as connecting to desire states, but that only happens because they ask the person.
Well, so it's sort of like, what was it, Thomas Nagel's essay?
What it's like to be a bat.
What it's like
to be something. Yes. Yeah, so that's one question, is like, what's the nature of consciousness? And then the second question is, should I be talking to you guys or talking
No, we can talk to each other. You guys you're all watching.
You're all in.
Well, you know what's funny actually about consciousness? When I was a little kid, I think I was like 6 years old, and I asked my mom, what is it like to get older?
Yeah.
And it was funny, and she said to me something that's still, we were in the drive-thru at McDonald's. I have wonderful parents. No, taking your kids to McDonald's is a fun thing. That was back when they had fries dipped in beef tallow back in the early 90s, and they replaced it. Never get the same. And the good Happy Meal toys. But she said, well, Trent, you get older on the outside, but the way you see things is still the same. And I thought that was a very profound, and it's always just kind of stuck with me. And I feel like,
even the idea that there's a you, that's the same you.
Yeah.
Even while you change physically and even psychologically, there's something else. The one who has the physical properties, the one who has the mental properties, the you.
Yeah.
Right.
What is that?
Yeah.
So that's the thing you're trying to answer.
Yeah. So that's the kind of the first stage, right? Like, what is it? And one of my conclusions is, well, whatever it is, it's like what you said, you're not going to be able just to describe matter in motion. And then that is not enough to describe all of you. That's not going to include
Now,
you.
there's some people who do try to do this. Maybe you can speak to this a little. There is a philosopher couple, Paul and Patricia Churchland.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, they've endorsed a view called like eliminative materialism.
Right.
Which is the idea that, Josh, just don't worry about your consciousness because it's basically just an illusion. It's like folk psychology.
Well, even illusions aren't real, right? Like if you think about an illusion in terms of an experience of something that doesn't match reality,
right?
There's no experiences, right? All there are brain states and matter and third person describable.
So
things.
From their perspective, there can only be material states described by the laws of physics. So what we think of as consciousness can't really exist, even though it sure seems like it's there.
Well, so they have a very interesting project, and it's to explain all of our talk and all of our thinking about consciousness in scientific terms. And so I think it's kind of an ambitious sort of project of science, really.
Yeah, like I think once they gave an example that where you would say, I have a headache, they just say, oh, the blood vessels in my brain are inflamed right now, as a way to just like catch yourself from doing that.
Yeah, right. And so, there is that option to eliminate the consciousness. My own view is that you can witness consciousness through introspection. People debate whether introspection is a reliable tool, but I would argue that without introspection, you actually wouldn't be able to do science. Because science is based on observations. And in order to know that you've made observations, you have to use introspection to be aware of your own sense of things. Otherwise, how would you know that you've made an observation?
So do you think sometimes when people are very attuned, they want this realist view of reality, science is very predictive, so it's got that going for it to make technology and things like that
it
for
works.
us.
Science works.
Yeah. But it seems like we forget the role of the scientist in all of this.
Yeah.
And that's where consciousness would come in.
Yeah, right. I think that it's kind of strange if a scientist comes to believe that there are no scientists.
Right.
Right. I mean, I did meet a philosopher who expressed skepticism about the real existence of persons. And this actually leads to the second stage of my research, which is not just about the nature of consciousness, but its origin.
Oh, okay.
And in my friend's words, he thought that getting conscious beings that have that first person self out of a sea of third person particles in motion was just impossible. And so that's the hard problem of consciousness, as you know.
Right. So how do you get from the fact that we know brains exist? Though what's interesting here is there's always, how do we know that? It seems like we do introspection on data, sense data.
We posit brains to explain our experiences. We don't posit our experiences to explain our brains.
Right.
That's where I think the sort of the eliminativist sometimes just has it backwards, because the eliminativist takes for granted the existence of brains.
Right.
But then, like, if anything's going to be taken for granted, it's what we experience in our own consciousness. Brains, we posit. Like, I've never seen my brain. Have you seen your brain?
No.
How do you know you have a brain?
Yeah. All I could say is, I mean, maybe on a medical chart, I saw somebody try to convince me it was a picture of my brain.
A picture, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But to see my own brain, I think the only time, I mean, it's possible if someone were in surgery, you could put up a mirror and maybe they could see it. But even there, I could imagine faking that with somebody.
Right. Now, guys, we're not really skeptical of brains here, right?
Right. But what's interesting,
the point is that consciousness, if
like,
anything, is clearer.
It's like we're making that inference. It's like when I get a
Exactly.
letter from my Nigerian prince friend telling me that I have a $50 billion fortune waiting. It's like, oh, well, it's certainly out there. No, the only thing I'm sure of is I have the letter in my hand. So it seems like with brains, it's like, well, I have like this letter in my head telling me I have this wonderful prize, this brain.
Yeah.
And I know the letter is there, and I just happen to really trust the letter. It's not like the Nigerian salesman.
Yeah.
But that trust is something that was built over time, or even an assumption. So yeah, but I mean, this is
I
just
love
so,
that metaphor. That's nice.
Yeah. So that's the great thing. That's what philosophers work with. It's just like, what's your tool bag? I have these metaphors and thought experiments to help understand,
organize
the
the concepts. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So the idea is then, so consciousness. So we agree that it's a real thing, and it is distinct from the brain. The mind and the brain are not the same thing. The introspection itself is real. Why do we have that in a world that seems to just be material?
Now, so I want to be very careful here. So I do think consciousness is not reducible to the brain. But when you say the mind and the brain aren't the same, the reason why I want to be careful here is because some people eliminate consciousness and some people eliminate brains.
Like substance dualists.
Yeah, or reduce brains to mental phenomenon.
Oh, okay.
And so I actually feel more confident that consciousness is real than that brains aren't themselves fundamentally reducible to aspects of consciousness themselves.
Okay.
So that's why I want to be very careful here, that really my view minimally would be that I'm one being and I have different aspects, including consciousness, right? And then this comes to your question still, right? Like whether there are brains, whatever the nature of brains, there is consciousness.
Right.
And so how does that exist?
And so we have this gap, though, the physical brain and then the immaterial reality of consciousness arising. How could we use this to point towards, let's say, the existence of God without committing a kind of God of the gaps fallacy here and saying, like, I don't know how the brain makes consciousness, so God must be doing it? Is there a way that's, maybe it's not a proof, but it's persuasive to say this points towards God being some kind of ultimate source of our consciousness?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of like two general strategies. One, we already kind of pointed to it when I talked about how you can turn mindless matter into a conscious being. Like think about this thing here. I won't get too far from the mic, but like, is this thing producing thoughts?
The windscreen of your mic, I'm assuming it does not.
Yeah, and probably it couldn't, right? The hard problem of consciousness is that it looks like this material is the wrong kind of material to explain consciousness. And what's true of this third person material is true of any different arrangement, because differences in arrangement aren't relevant to explain first person experiences.
Right. Ultimately, that windscreen of the microphone and the brain, at a most fundamental level, they're the same kinds of like quarks and electrons.
Yeah, exactly.
It's arranged
It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be one strategy, is to argue from the hard problem or from the construction problem. It'd basically be to accept Alexander Rosenberg, who's a philosopher of physics, his premise that from physics, you can't get thoughts.
Yes, he's the author of The Atheist's Guide to Reality, and he says that, like, intentionality.
Yes.
The idea that how could something about Antarctica, frozen Antarctica, be in my 98-degree brain cells in my head?
I love that.
There is nothing, there are a lot of properties my brain cells could have. They could have the property of having electrical current, they could have the property of being composed of carbon-based matter, but the property of about Antarctica seems totally different from that. So Rosenberg says, well, it just doesn't have that property. But I'm doing it right now, Alex. I'm thinking about Antarctica.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because you might think, well, maybe your brain can somehow represent Antarctica, like a map can represent things, right? But the problem there is that representation itself seems to depend on or presuppose this more basic notion of aboutness or thoughts. So like in a map case, you have a key, and the key tells you like which things stand for which things. Well, how do you know how to interpret that key? There has to already be a mind that assigns the meaning.
Right. And I think it gets even worse, because sometimes when I think of like qualia or jargon alert for philosophy.
What it's like.
Yeah. What things are like. And I love how philosophy is like, well, we need a word to say what things are like. Qualia. Like what? Qualia. How about qualia? Did you just cough into the microphone at the philosophers conference and they just had to run with it? Yeah. You know, like it's like where they come up with these things. Quarks, actually, I think it comes from who's the author of Ulysses, James Joyce. He wrote a poem, and there's a line in Ulysses or a poem James Joyce wrote, and it was 3 quarks for Mr. Mork.
Okay.
And then some physicist was like, that's a good weird word for this weird particle. We'll call them quarks. But it gets weirder, I think. It's not just like I represent an image of Antarctica. Like I feel like I can have a conscious recollection of the feeling of putting an ice cube on my tongue. You know, and so not just a mental image, but I'm really recalling what that sensory perception was like.
Yeah,
that gets
absolutely.
even harder for the aboutness of a sensory perception to just some kind of material thing in my brain. Yeah,
and the thought isn't that it's not integrated into a brain. It's just that it's different from and not explained just in terms of the brain.
Right.
So the first strategy then is the construction problem. How do you construct first person consciousness from mindless matter? The second strategy is a kind of more modest, and I think this might even be kind of more effective in conversation, is to think in terms of predictive success. So you just ask, if fundamental reality has conscious capacity or people building resources, if it's a supreme being, that would successfully predict that reality can unfold to produce conscious beings like us.
Right. So we think, okay, if the ultimate foundation of reality are quarks, that would predict other quarks or fundamental particles. Great.
Yeah.
And so we see that. But if the ultimate foundation of reality is a being with causal power that has intentions that can bring about conscious states and be aware, then if it has causal power and can bring about these things, we would expect, at the very least, we would expect other observers, if not conscious observers, and physical things for them to interact with.
Yeah, it predicts the materials for consciousness.
Right.
It predicts that there's a mind that can produce that. If you have the fundamental physics, quarks and bosons and the like, these things don't by themselves, even if in principle they could produce consciousness,
right?
Even if we could overcome that hard problem, still they don't predict in their own right consciousness.
Well, this gets back to another issue in philosophy about philosophical zombies or p-zombies.
Yeah.
This idea that, well, perhaps you could have, let's call it, we have world. I love a philosopher talk. It's fun being with a philosopher because we can joke about other philosophers. You're the real philosopher because you have a PhD. I'm just having fun with this. But you can have, world one and then world prime, which is a physical copy of our world that lacks consciousness. And it seems like you could have that because it's physically identical.
Yeah.
Could you have that and just the laws of physics allows things to continue? And there's just nothing going on.
Well, right. I mean, like I've created computer programs to simulate evolution, and those programs never produced conscious beings.
Right.
Again, even if it's possible in principle, that doesn't mean it's predicted or remotely probable.
Right.
Right. And so if it's improbable on mindless matter to get consciousness, but more probable on theism to get consciousness, then consciousness is evidence for us. This is like kind of a modest argument. It's evidence for it points
We're
to
just saying
theism.
The fact that consciousness exists
It's a clue.
Right. It is more likely if God exists, and it would be something we would not expect if there were a God. But if God does exist, consciousness is surprising on atheism, but expected on theism.
Yeah, at least it's more surprising on atheism than on theism.
Yeah, it would still be a surprising thing, but it's far more surprising. Well, great. Well, hey, what can you point our listeners? You have a great new book out. What I love about your work is you take all the philosophical hoity-toity talk and break it down for people to understand. So can you tell people about your recent book and where they can get that and learn more about what you do?
Okay, yeah. So, How Reason Can Lead to God, that one's published and out, and people can get that. The book I'm working on is not out yet, but it's on consciousness.
Okay.
So they can't get that yet, but it's forthcoming. But probably...
So now it only exists right here.
For you. It exists on paper.
Oh, okay.
The draft is done, but it's just not yet out into the bookshelves.
I see.
Right? But people can get more resources. I have this Worldview Design Training Center, and it's just go to worldview-design.com, and you can get access to that, or send me an email for more information about that. And that's where you can get lots of resources, and there's lots of people in there, Christian philosophers and other philosophers, and apologists in there thinking about these questions. Yeah.
Okay. So that book will come out soon. For now, though, I also recommend people get your great book, How Reason Can Lead to God.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
All right.
Yep.
Well, thank you guys so much. Be sure to check out Josh's work. I'll leave some descriptions in the link. Some links in the description of the video below. And hey, thanks for stopping by the Council of Trent.
This is awesome.
I'll have to have you back on. And thank you guys for watching, and I hope you all have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.